I thought of framing my statements with the words of the late Howard Zinn, who is an American historian who's Jewish, who is mainly noted for his work on people's history. He wrote an article around the Vietnam War called saying that the problem is civil obedience. We're a group of Jewish Canadians who came together in all the major cities of Canada out of horror about Israel's 2006 war on Gaza and Lebanon, and out of outrage that organizations like the Canadian Jewish Congress and B'nai B'rith pose themselves as speaking for all Jewish people here. I would like to speak to the current political circumstances in Canada and Israel. It is pertinent that an independent Jewish voice be heard as the Canadian and Israeli governments persist in criminal actions and their own racism while deflecting attention and exonerating their culpability by focusing on a purported new anti-Semitism. Here in Canada, I am thinking about the government's deflecting attention from the Afghan detainees, from Omar Khadr and security certificate prisoners, from Canada's climate change position, which directly threatens millions of lives in the circumpolar north, in Africa and Asia this century. What also of the implicit racism when leaders of the conservative and liberal parties say they do not lose sleep over the killing of civilians and speak of massacres using unconventional weapons as a measured response, such as they did in 2006. We are concerned that the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism, in collaboration with the Canadian Jewish Congress in its pursuit of exposing the so-called new anti-Semitism, is flirting with dangerous and anti-democratic rhetoric, as legitimate criticism of Israel's human rights violations may be equated with the horrific reality of anti-Semitism. The Harper government, in cutting off funds and interfering in a number of organizations, among them Kairos and UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Administration, represents an interference in our democratic process here in Canada. But far worse, the cutoff of these funds also directly involves threats to the availability of water, food, and medical care for political victims all over the world. For UNRWA, they're the victims, the Palestinian victims, and through Kairos, through their advocacy work on behalf of victims, for instance, of the Canadian extractive industries. So the cutoff of funds really is a life and death matter, for many people. Because of the threat of being accused of anti-Semitism, a whole range of facts remain taboo to acknowledge, and a whole range of distortions of reality here are not questioned. In my brief statement here, I will quote from several Jewish people who have impeccable credentials. There are certainly innumerable non-Jewish people just as qualified, but Jewish people cannot as easily be accused of anti-Semitic intentions. I'll mention that last year in January, I spoke at a press conference called by David Orchard concerning the massacre in Gaza at that time. Anton Querty and Ursula Franklin, who are recipients of the Order of Canada, spoke about their shame about being Canadian and about being Jewish, and also the words "never again," which were certainly connected with the Holocaust, really applied to all people. In December and January of 2008, Richard Falk, who was a UN Special Rapporteur for human rights in the occupied territories, tried to enter Gaza. This was right before the invasion at the end of December, and he was not allowed into Gaza. He wrote, quote, "The recent developments in Gaza are especially disturbing because they express so vividly a deliberate intention on the part of Israel and its allies to subject an entire human community to life-endangering conditions of utmost cruelty. The suggestion that this pattern of conduct is a Holocaust in the making represents a rather desperate appeal to the governments of the world and to international public opinion to act urgently to prevent these current genocidal tendencies from culminating in a collective tragedy. If ever the ethos of a responsibility to protect, recently adopted by the UN Security Council as the basis of humanitarian intervention, is applicable, it would be to act now to start protecting the people of Gaza from further pain and suffering. As with the victims of Hurricane Katrina and of the Haiti earthquake, the restorations of the essentials for life never get to the people of Gaza. This all in the name of security. So I think this is another way that deflection of criticism by focusing on anti-Semitism at this particular time really deflects from the really unconscionable role that Canada continues to play in many countries. Now, what is the eternal war on terror, of which Canada and Israel are willing participants with their lucrative arms trades? Let me quote from Henry Siegman's article, Israel's Lies, published in the London Review of Books in 2009. Henry Siegman, by the way, is director of the U.S. Middle East Project in New York and is a visiting research professor at the University of London. He is a former national director of the American Jewish Congress and the Synagogue Council of America. So obviously Richard Falk and Henry Siegman are extremely prominent Jewish people. Siegman wrote, Western governments and most of the Western media have accepted a number of Israeli claims justifying the military assault on Gaza, that Hamas consistently violated the 6-month truce that Israel observed and then refused to extend it, that Israel therefore had no choice but to destroy Hamas's capacity to launch missiles into Israeli towns, that Hamas is a terrorist organization, part of a global jihadi network, and that Israel has acted not only in its own defense, but on behalf of an international struggle by Western democracies against this network. Middle East peacemaking has been smothered in deceptive euphemisms, so let me state bluntly that each of these claims is a lie. And I urge you to read his article for the details. I would also remark that just to remind you that Canada was the first country that withdrew recognition and support of the newly elected government way back in early 2006. Another prominent Jewish person, Harley on the left, James Wilkinson, who had been the president of the World Bank and was serving as the U.S. envoy to Gaza, wrote at that time that the new unity government, meaning Hamas and Fatah, needed to be supported, and that the collapse of health services and the education system, which addresses the needs of 1 million children, would be a total failure for the new government and would have tragic consequences for the Palestinian people. This should not be permitted under any circumstances. A quote from Howard Zinn, who said, "How can you make a war on terror if war itself is terrorism? Terrorism became the justification for war, but war is itself terrorism, breeding rage and hate, as we are seeing now." Of utmost concern now is the danger posed by Israeli and Canadian policies as we begin this very difficult century, faced with real possibilities of extinction. Canada and Israel model impunity in the face of international law and treaties, undermining of the United Nations, fear-mongering that deflects attention from the severe threats of nuclear holocaust and climate catastrophe. Israel models new modes of warfare with a tolerance for unconventional weapons and for methods of urban warfare, modeling the ethos of the survival of the privileged. I will end with a quote from Richard Falk. He writes, "It is an unfortunate tactic of many Zionists to treat any criticism of the state of Israel or its policies as tantamount to anti-Semitism. In my view, this is a profoundly anti-democratic attitude that tries to turn the citizen into a subject. I believe that the test of good citizenship is conscience, not obedience.